Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the second panel organized by the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights for the Palestinian People on Displacement as a Continuum, the ongoing Nakba. Before we begin, we would like you to show you a short video clip from the documentary Voices Across the Divide. And then we will start the discussion afterwards. So please.
As I interviewed Palestinians of different ages, I realized that the Nakba is not really over. I interviewed a woman named Hannah. She was born in Jaffa. She left as a young woman. She lost everything, and her family fled to Ramallah. And then I interviewed her daughter, Terry, who grew up in a fairly middle-class life in Ramallah until she experienced the 1967 war.
The story of the Nakba was a story for my sisters and I till 1967. It was my grandfather's story, it was my mother's story, it was a trauma. But, you know, when you're a child, you don't understand it. So in 1967, it stopped being a story. Israel struck Egypt, and it was war.
So let's place you. 67, you're in Ramallah.
I'm in Ramallah.
You're how old?
10 years old.
You're going to Catholic school.
Catholic school. Life is wonderful. There's nothing wrong. And all of a sudden, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell. Our house became a shelter because we have a basement. So we have 30 neighbors sitting in a small place, listening to a small transistor radio. No electricity whatsoever. Everybody gathered their food, but the grown-up basically knew that we need to ration. And after 3 or 4 days, the ration became, less and less.
Thank you. As I said, this afternoon's discussion is on displacement as a continuum, the ongoing Nakba. This panel, the panel is highlighting the fact that the Nakba was not a singular instance, was not a singular moment, a singular incident, which occurred and ended in 1948, but rather a continued action until today, which is still ongoing, in the absence of a solution, of the just and peaceful solution of the question of Palestine. It's even more, I dare to say, that it is exacerbating and it's complicating further the search for a solution. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator, Ms. May Alice Cannon, Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, based in Washington, D.C. She has been Senior Director of Advocacy and Outreach for World Vision US and worked as a consultant to the Middle East for child advocacy issues. May I now request you, Ms. Cannon, to introduce the speakers of this panel and to moderate this panel. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Vice Chair Iwanez. It's a privilege to be here. Good afternoon, and as he mentioned, welcome to the Displacement as a Continuum, the ongoing Nakba. This morning we began by talking about 1948 and its historical significance, but this afternoon we'll be continuing the conversation by talking about how many aspects of 1948, the Nakba and displacement, continue even today in the 21st century. My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. You might have heard Hanan Ashrawi earlier today was talking about American evangelicals. I am an American evangelical, but I am committed to a just peace in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I have the privilege I heard an amen, and we're not even in church. I have the privilege of leading an ecumenical organization of 28 Christian denominations in the United States, including Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and evangelical Christians that are working to encourage the United States government to actively promote a comprehensive resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as other conflicts in the Middle East. Our mission at Churches for Middle East Peace is to mobilize U.S. Christians to embrace a holistic perspective of the conflict. You might notice I didn't say a balanced perspective of the conflict because we acknowledge the significant power differentials that are at play between Palestinians and Israelis. So we seek to embrace a holistic perspective of the conflict, to be advocates of equality, human rights, security, and justice for Palestinians, Israelis, and all people of the Middle East. Our panel this afternoon is called The Ongoing Nakba, which reminds me of a quote by an Israeli historian, Gershom Gorenberg. Writing about the origins of the settler movement in the days following 1967 and the war, he notes, quote, "The action of establishing settlements fits the predate strategy of the Zionist left, which believed in creating facts, using fait accompli to determine the political future of disputed land. Israel's early years saw a painful passage as rebels became leaders. Now, though, after 1967, officials were defying the laws of the country they served. In the process, they marked out occupied land as a reserve belonging to a different time, before 1948, except now Jews could play the role of both government and rebel." Today's discussion complements this assessment of the continuities in Israeli policy since 1948 by looking at the continuities in the Palestinian experience. Just as Gorenberg argues, the settlement strategy that led to the establishment of Israel was never abandoned after 1948, and so too has the Nakba continued to be an ongoing reality in the lives of Palestinians. Joining us today, we have several distinguished human rights advocates and scholars. We have Ms. Suhad Bishara, the Director of Land and Planning Rights Unit with the human rights organization Adallah. We have Mr. Itay Epshtain, the Head of Policy Protection and Humanitarian Advocacy in Palestine for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and Dr. Seraje Assi, a visiting researcher at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. I will introduce each of them and give them an opportunity for opening remarks, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and for question. We'll begin with Suhad. Ms. Bishara grew up in Tarshisha, a predominantly Palestinian village in the northern Galilee. After completing her education at Hebrew University and receiving her LLM in public service from New York University, she started working for Adallah, the first Palestinian-run legal center in Israel, and the sole Palestinian organization that works before Israeli courts to protect the human rights of Palestinians in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Ms. Bishara is an expert on the linkages between Israeli law and the effects of the Nakba on the Palestinian people on both sides of the Green Line. So I now give her the opportunity for opening remarks.
Good afternoon to all, and thank you again for the invitation and for this opportunity. In the little time that I have, I will try to set up 4 pieces puzzle to suggest a holistic perspective on the Israeli regime vis-a-vis the different fragments of the Palestinian people from the conception of the ongoing Nakba, of course, because Israel still and the perception that it has unfinished businesses with the different fragments of the Palestinian people. So piece 1 is, of course, the major Nakba events during the 47, 48, and ongoing until early 50s. And the problem of the Palestinian refugees who became refugees outside of their homeland, outside of Palestine, in the refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere. And I will not go into the figures, of course, but for the purposes of my presentation, I will address two things that Israel did right after that, which will connect to the other three pieces. One, they nationalized so-called the Palestinian refugees' lands. Nationalized in the sense of not only it became under Israeli law Israeli lands, but also nationalized the conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict during the Nakba is an international one. What happened after the Nakba, in the early 50s, Israel said, I will administer these properties, including the refugees who might enter Israel and who might not, under Israeli national law. So they nationalized all of the issue of the refugees. The refugees' properties became under Israeli law and against international law as Israeli properties. In the past decade or so, Israel started selling refugees' properties, claiming by the AG that these properties became under Israeli law Israeli properties, and Israel is entitled to sell these properties, undermining, of course, the right of the refugees to return and restitute their lands. Second, dominating who enters and can become a citizen or a resident of Israel under Israeli national law. Again, undermining the right of return, irrespective of international law, irrespective of view and resolutions about the right of return, and many others. So we have the first piece where Israel basically controlled the issue of the refugees by national law, suspending international law, and determining its sovereignty over the issue and how it should be resolved. The second piece is the Nakba and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which also reflected in arbitrary, massive confiscations of land during the 50s, the beginning of the 50s, including the absenteeist property law, which was the major law, confiscated the Palestinian refugees' land, and internal, what's called as the validation law, parallel to the one that was enacted last year, vis-a-vis some of the settlements in the West Bank. Internal displacement of the Palestinians, or some of them who became citizens of Israel, amounting now over 300,000, denied still the ability to go back to their homes and villages in Israel, also as citizens. So internal refugees, and again, massive confiscations of Palestinian land, targeting the Palestinian land and targeting the Palestinian nationals who became citizens. And thus, citizenship became, back then and still unfortunately now, something does not grant the Palestinian citizen any sort of rights, constitutional rights, at least on these subjects. Now, at some points, the Palestinian citizens in different points of their legal history with the Israeli legal regime tried to stress that we are citizens and we are entitled to for constitutional rights. So they addressed the Supreme Court saying, in the famous Iqr case, that there is a court decision in the 50s that allows us to go back to our homes and villages 20, 30 years after they addressed the court again, saying, we want you to obligate the Israeli political system and the government to implement the Supreme Court's decision from the 50s, to go back. And then in the 90s, the Supreme Court said something like this: although no security considerations anymore valid in the circumstances, still we cannot allow you back, because this would have a lot of ramifications on the issue of right of return of the Palestinian refugees and the entire internally displaced people. So basically what the court said, that we refuse to see you as citizen, rather we see you as a Palestinian national, which we back then targeted your land, yeah, And that's a closed case. We will never open that. And your citizenship does not grant you anything that we don't grant to any other Palestinian refugee who became a refugee outside of their homeland. So again, suspension of the constitutional framework that should protect the rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel vis-a-vis the conception that we targeted as Israelis, the Palestinian land, and you're not entitled to anything further constitutionally. The third, another example, basically, vis-a-vis the Palestinian citizens that's happening currently, the Nakba. The Nakba is the southern part of Israel where about 200,000 Palestinian Bedouin citizens alive, going constantly for decades until nowadays, and unfortunately in the future. Constant policy and attempts to displace, replace, as was mentioned in the previous panel. Al-Hiran is being displaced to build on the ruins Hiran as a Jewish town. Al-Araqib is being displaced to plant a GNF forest. Attir is being displaced to plant a GNF forest, and many others. 60 or 70,000 Bedouin Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel under imminent threat of forced displacement for the same policy during the military regime in the 50s, and it's happening in the West Bank, to replace, to Jewadize, and to control more Palestinian land. Third piece in the puzzle is the West Bank and East Jerusalem, of course. Yeah. The same as the absentee property law, immediately after the occupation, a military order that's very similar to the absentee property law that takes over the Palestinian refugees' lands in 1967. Illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, nationalizing again part of the conflict in East Jerusalem, imposing illegally the Israeli sovereignty over the area. And I would not undergo details. Currently, dozens of annexation bills being discussed in different levels in the parliament and in the government, like Jerusalem and its daughters, which has an aspect of bringing into Israel massive settlements and getting rid of some Palestinians, like it has an aspect of more territory and less Palestinian people in the terms of demographic engineering. So we have, again, the aspect of nationalizing. We manage the conflict under Israeli law, suspending international human rights law, suspending international humanitarian law for the sake of Jewadizing and controlling more territory. The rest of the West Bank, of course, I assume that most of you know the facts on the ground in terms of the settlements and the ongoing expanding settlements and building new settlements. But I do want to address one recent development on this issue. Last year, Israeli parliament has enacted what's known as the validation law. So far, Israeli targeted a lot of the they call the public lands in the West Bank. And since the past 2 years, they started targeting also Palestinian private-owned land for the sake of the settlement expansion and new settlements. So they enacted the validation law in order to retroactively try to validate settlements that were built in the West Bank on Palestinian private-owned lands. We're talking about thousands of structures all over the West Bank. And again, imposing sovereignty, Israeli national law in the West Bank. Now, petitioning against the law, the Israeli government replied in a very clear that keeps no doubt about the position of Israel. And Israel stated before the Israeli Supreme Court, one, that Jewish settlements in the West Bank fulfill the values of Zionism, The settlement regularization law is justified by its political, national, and social purposes. 3, it is the natural right of Jewish Israelis to live in this area, meaning the West Bank. 4, the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, is the source of the authority of the military commander in the West Bank, and that this legislator is not subject in any way to international law. And 5, Israeli settlers in the West Bank are a local civilian population under international law whose needs must be addressed by the military governor. Meaning, no occupation, full sovereignty, it's a natural right of the Jewish people, and it's part of Israel. Again, the third card, suspension of IHL, suspension of international human rights law for the sake of controlling more land, annexing, for the exclusive use of the Jewish people. The fourth card that I want to bring in is, of course, Gaza. And I don't want to get into the details of the blockade for over a decade on Gaza and its effect on the people, and the violation of international human rights law and IHL, and so on and so on. But I do want to address the most recent events, not in terms of numbers and casualties and fatalities. But again, I want to refer to a legal document that was submitted to the Israeli Supreme Court in response to a petition filed against using snipers and live ammunition to kill civil unarmed demonstrators in Gaza, where we argued that law enforcement paradigm based on international human rights law should bind Israel in reacting to these civil demonstrations, meaning that they cannot use live ammunition to spread civil demonstration. In a very weird legal document, basically the Israeli Attorney General and expert in international law in the Israeli army said that basically creating a paradigm of law enforcement within IHL that does not really exist. I mean, those of you who are familiar with international human rights law, it does not exist. Either you have IHL or law enforcement paradigm. But they did that, so they want that's a non-existing established body of law that has been invented by Israel in an attempt to justify the conduct of its armed forces in their deadly response to the Gaza protest, and to give the Israeli forces greater leeway to use lethal fire than that provided for in the regular paradigm of law enforcement. The invented category of law enforcement within IHL attempts also to circumvent even the limitations imposed by IHL on the exercise of force via customary distinction between combatants and civilians during armed conflict. What Israel legally is saying, that if we are in an armed combatant conflict situation, IHL allows us to shoot on combatants. It does not allow us to shoot non-combatant civilians. But what Israel is saying now, even if we are not in a combatant situation, in a civil paradigm situation of civilian population demonstrating, we are still allowed to shoot, even non-combatants, because we expect that they might pose a threat in the near future. A paradigm, again, that does not exist. I might lead, maybe did, to war crimes. So again, summing the fourth card, suspension of IHL, suspension of international human rights law for the sole purpose of Israel serving its interest as one regime. So if I will try to sum. Bring in the four cards together into one puzzle and take the four fragments of the Palestinian people: Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, citizens of Israel, and refugees. Israel is managing, during its policy, to suspend all and the only relevant legal frameworks, whether nationally in terms of constitutional rights vis-a-vis its Palestinian citizens, international vis-a-vis Gaza, West Bank, and refugees, for the sole purpose of its interests. So I think it is time to zoom out a little bit and to look at this regime as one regime that controls Palestinians' lives wherever they are, even if they are refugees. The mere fact that they do not allow the refugees back, they control their life. Or their properties, whether they are in the West Bank and Israel. I think if we zoom out and look at the Israeli regime from this perspective, we might be much more creative in our thinking about the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhad. I look forward to us talking a bit further about some of the differentials between the Palestinian citizens of Israel and their treatment under Israeli law, and then Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territory as well. Thank you. We'll next hear from Mr. Itay Epshtain, who works as the head of policy, protection, and humanitarian advocacy in Palestine for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Itay is one of the foremost advocates of human rights for displaced people, and the NRC promotes and defends displaced people's rights and dignity in local communities with national governments and in the international arena. Mr. Epshtain specializes on the risk of displacement facing Palestinians, particularly in East Jerusalem, and so he now will start with opening remarks.
Thank you, Reverend, and thank you, Co-Chair, for extending the invitation to join this panel. I'll try and pick up where my colleague, Advocate Bishara, left off. If there's anything that the events of the recent days and weeks in Gaza have reminded us, is that Palestinians experience, they are at risk of violence, forcible transfer, denial of access to livelihoods, essential services, and are in need of protection. Today, I will comment on the risk of forcible transfer, and we'll try and envisage together how to better protect Palestinians, refugees, and those who are internally displaced. Internal displacement in Palestine is caused by various triggers. However, they are all intrinsically related to the Israeli occupation. Since the early 2000s, with the construction of the separation wall, there's been an increased recognition of the significance of internal displacement as a consequence of Israeli policies and practices, and the importance of improving monitoring and response by the humanitarian community. Linked to this, there's been growing awareness that the internationally acknowledged definition of an internally displaced person, an IDP, set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, is applicable to occupied Palestinian territory. The extent of internal displacement resultant on Israeli action needs to be quantified, both to enable advocating respect for international law, be it international humanitarian or human rights law, and to provide protection and aid to Palestinians that are adversely affected. Let me say this: the driver of displacement in Palestine has been, historically, and at present, the desire to acquire territory by force or coercion, and to render that acquisition permanent, if you will, to render occupation, which is inherently a temporary state of affairs, a permanent fixture of Palestinian life. Well, who are the internally displaced Palestinians? We estimate that as of January 2018, there are at least 230,000 Palestinians internally displaced. Of those, some 60% are Palestine refugees. They have been displaced once twice, 3, 4 times over in their lifetime or within as the generations have progressed, of which 20,000 individuals remain displaced in Gaza as a consequence of the 2014 hostilities between Israel and Palestinian armed groups. Destruction of property, along with a broad range of other practices and policies, contribute to a coercive environment in the West Bank, particularly, as you've kindly mentioned, in Area C and East Jerusalem, which is leading to the forcible transfer of households, at times entire communities. There are now, and this map you'll see is from the UN OCHA database, of roughly 11,000 pending demolition orders issued by the Israeli military commander, affecting over 15,000 structures in Area C of the West Bank, and those include homes, community assets, including schools, clinics. They are all at risk of wanton and extensive destruction. Over 50,000 people live in roughly 100 communities in Area C of the West Bank at heightened risk of forcible transfer. Another 220,000 in East Jerusalem face the risk of residency revocation, displacement, and statelessness. Those that have been identified at particular risk are pastoralists and Bedouin communities living in areas under Israeli control, in particular in the Jerusalem periphery. Communities in or near areas that are designated by Israel as closed military zones, I should say illegally so, including those in the northern Jordan Valley or in the south of the West Bank in the South Hebron Hills, farmers with land in the seam zone between the separation wall and the 1949 armistice line, and residents of Israeli-controlled parts of Hebron and Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. Many Palestinians throughout the West Bank, as I've said, are at risk of displacement and forcible transfer due to a coercive environment generated by deliberate, I stress, deliberate Israeli policies and practices. These practices, which include the destruction or threat of destruction of homes, schools, and livelihood-related structures due to the lack of building permits. Most of you would know these are impossible to obtain. Aggressive promotion of plans to forcibly relocate, forcibly transfer communities en masse to designated relocation sites, to urbanize pastoralists into urban townships, restrictions on access to natural resources, and that include water, the denial of basic service infrastructure, and the lack, particularly for East Jerusalemite, of secure residency. And those are often implemented against the backdrop of the establishment, expansion, consolidation of Israeli settlements. Palestinians at risk of displacement, the very essence of displacement in Palestine is intrinsically related to the desire to expand and consolidate settlement blocks, and I'll come to that, back to that in a minute. I've mentioned destruction of property as one very visible driver of displacement. In Area C and in East Jerusalem, house demolitions and evictions result in heightened protection risk, and they are the result of Israeli planning restrictions, which create a coercive environment, undermine the shelter needs of the Palestinian population. Mass displacement for high-risk communities becomes an increasing concern. We have identified, together with our colleagues in the humanitarian community, 61 communities that are at imminent risk of forcible transfer. Since 2009, some 5,500 structures were destroyed. Those include 900 humanitarian assets, homes, schools, kindergartens, clinics, places of worship. 53,000 people have been adversely affected as a result, as a consequence of the destruction of property. You will see that most demolitions take place in Area C and in East Jerusalem. A smaller proportion happens in Area A and B. I should note those are, for the most part, punitive house demolitions, again, in violation of international humanitarian law and the law of belligerent occupation. The structures affected include both homes and livelihood-related structure and community infrastructure, community assets. How does that impact Palestinians? The reason I present this is because we have heard Israeli officials say that forcibly transferring, forcibly urbanizing Palestinians or displacing them within Jerusalem will be to their benefit. They will be able to access better services. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a survey we've conducted of 420 households that have been displaced. The results are unequivocal. I won't read through everything, but you can get a sense of how this is negatively affected. This is to the absolute detriment of Palestinians in terms of access to basic services, in terms of housing conditions, in terms of access to primary health care and education, and in terms of the burden it puts particularly on women and children. And as I've already mentioned, this is intrinsically related to the desire to expand settlements. We are right next door to the Security Council, and despite the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2334 in December of 2016, calling on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity, Israel has instead has expanded those. In 2017, 3,000 new settlement homes in the West Bank were approved for construction, while in the first 3 months of 2018, a further 1,100 settlement homes in 20 settlements were approved. In East Jerusalem, 1,500 settlement housing units were approved following the U.S. presidential elections in November 2016. And in 2017, this uptick continued with another 2,200 units in East Jerusalem advanced through the planning system. The settlement neighborhoods in East Jerusalem are strategically located around the city in a manner that fragments Palestinian communities. It separates them from the remainder of the West Bank and creates access restrictions and disruptions to Palestinians' daily lives. And perhaps, I think this graph is very telling. I've come to refer to this as the Trump effect. I'm not sure you're able to see this, but there's the graph goes up dramatically after November 2016. Statements made by the U.S. administration embolden Israeli settlement expansion. And unfortunately, the measures envisaged by Security Council Resolution 2334 have not proven to be effective in reversing that trend. Where does that lead us? To annexation. The unlawful annexation of East Jerusalem by Israel and the ensuing and continued exercise of Israeli authority there, despite the international community's condemnation, offers a compelling cautionary tale as to how annexation can severely impact the lives of Palestinians when it is not appropriately addressed and redressed. Further, the relocation of the U.S. Embassy, and we hear other diplomatic missions to Jerusalem in contravention of OP 5 of Security Council Resolution 478, emboldens Israeli initiatives at annexing occupied Palestinian territory. This has a history to it, from the Alon Plan in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 occupation, calling for vast expenses of the West Bank to be annexed by Israel, and that includes Greater Jerusalem that corresponds to the corpus separatum. In the morning panel, there was a mention of the corpus separatum. The notion was to negate the corpus separatum by annexing East Jerusalem, but also more recent plans. This is the 2013 plan introduced by Minister Naftali Bennett. This is a map that would appear familiar to all of you. It's area A, B, and C of the West Bank. If you look at the key carefully, you will see it reads area A and B, but then there is no area C. It just says full Israeli control. And that, together with increased political will within the Israeli government to push towards formal annexation of Area C, and Suhad was kind to mention this. There are currently 10 or 11 draft bills before Knesset looking at annexation of different settlement blocks. And these bills propose to apply Israeli legislation sovereignty directly onto the West Bank. I've gone through a bit of an exercise to map those settlements that are mentioned by name in those 10 draft bills. That link you see there will take you to an interactive map. But just to give you a sense, what you're seeing here are those settlements that are intended to be annexed in 10 different blocks, and the 110 Palestinian communities that will be adversely affected through the annexation. Because in the path of consolidation of settlement blocks, in the path of settlement expansion and annexation, there will be communities that would be either subjected to further marginalization if they are annexed, and this is what East Jerusalem has demonstrated, or this will be the driver of their forcible transfer into other parts of occupied territory, perhaps outside occupied territory. And that includes the H2 area of Hebron, the Nablus periphery, the Bethlehem periphery, neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, and of course the Bethlehem periphery was already mentioned, in the South Hebron Hills. Let me say annexation would both exacerbate the risk of forcible transfer, and it will forestall support for humanitarian assistance in communities within settlement blocks. They will be outside our reach, very much like communities at peril in East Jerusalem. It will inherently limit the provision of essential services, access to productive land and productive land usage, and any development initiatives targeting these communities. Let me conclude by stating something that should be obvious in this chamber. It is a well-established rule of international law that a state cannot acquire territory or sovereignty in foreign territory by threat or the use of force. Accordingly, annexation of a territory occupied through military force is unlawful. The Hague Regulations, the Fourth Geneva Convention, they are all of customary character, and they prescribe that. Furthermore, one of the basic tenets of international humanitarian law is to protect the interests of the ousted sovereign following belligerent occupation of a foreign territory. The occupant, and this is a reminder to Israel, only administers an occupied territory temporarily. And consistent with the prohibition on annexation, an occupation does not transfer title or sovereignty over the territory. To that extent, an occupying power must also respect the existing laws and institutions in place. As such, the law of occupation itself prohibits annexation, and it is designed to impede the effects thereof. Indeed, it has been posted that should an occupant hold out in bad faith, use its control of the occupied territory as political leverage, this would amount to outright annexation, and such acts must be deemed illegal, while the continued rule of the occupant can be deemed a form of aggression, calling for its suppression. Let me conclude by saying, this morning we heard, I think, a very lively and interesting debate on what is the preferential option for the realization of Palestinian self-determination, 1 or 2 states. I wish to say that I prescribe to the notion that it is up to Palestinians to determine what is the most appropriate modality for them to realize the right to self-determination. But I fear it was a misplaced debate. It is not whether we will have 1 state or 2. What we are witnessing is an occupation with no due date, with no end in sight. I think the real risk is that the acquisition of territory will become permanent and the occupation more protracted and prolonged that we have ever imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epshtain. I'm looking forward to, as the conversation continues and as our panel discussion continues, we will be talking about possible interventions to some of the realities that you just articulated. So eager to move into that. But before we do, we have one more introduction and remarks from Dr. Seraje Assi, who holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where he currently serves as a visiting researcher at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. His editorial pieces have been published by Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and the Foreign Policy Journal, and his new book that just came out in 2018 is called The History and Politics of the Bedouin, Reimagining Nomadism in Modern Palestine. He currently teaches at Georgetown University and American University in Washington, D.C. Mr. Assi is an expert and will share with us specifically about some of the implications of ongoing displacement and the continual Nakba as it relates to Palestinians in Gaza. Please.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this well-framed and timely forum. I say well-framed because, first, the forum recognizes 1948 as the starting point for any meaningful discussion on the roots of the conflict in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. And second, because it acknowledges the fact that the hunting legacy of the Nakba persists today in myriad ways, especially in the context of Gaza. And I say timely because the forum comes on the heels of the Great March of Return, which marks a stark reminder that the crisis in Gaza is first and foremost a refugee crisis, one that is alive and still awaits justice, perhaps now more than ever. The peaceful protests also mark a symbolic shift by reclaiming the 70-year-old refugee question as the root cause of the conflict and the basis for a just and lasting peace in Palestine. The protests also mark a strategic shift in Palestinian politics, with the majority of Palestinians now in favor of a struggle for equal human rights over liberation. For besides reviving dreams of return, what the protesters hoped to achieve was to draw attention to the humanitarian calamity in Gaza, as if reminding us that the Nakba is not a dead or past memory, but an ongoing reality. To understand how we got there, we need to view these events within their historical context. Since its creation, Gaza has known 2 political realities, occupation and blockade. But the founding reality of Gaza was and remains displacement. And to understand how this founding reality continues to influence and shape current events in Gaza, we need to go back in time at least 70 years, all the way back to 1948, when virtually overnight, Gaza was turned from a thriving coastal district to one huge refugee camp. The story is familiar to many. In the mass exodus that accompanies Israel's founding in 1948, 7 150,000 Palestinians were expelled and forced to flee their homes and become lifetime refugees. 300,000 of those uprooted flooded into Gaza. That was more than 1/3 of the total refugee population. As a result, the population of Gaza, which had numbered 80,000 before the war, tripled overnight. With 2/3 of its population now refugees, Gaza resembled a colossal tent city squashed between desert and sea. 8 refugee camps were created in Gaza around that year. And while the Gaza Strip comprised 100th, 1.6, of the total area of Mandate Palestine, which is about 140 square miles, it now provided a sanctuary for a quarter of its Arab population. Submerged by waves of displaced people, Gaza became a Noah's Ark for Arab Palestine that had vanished in 1948. The tragedy was further aggravated by the demarcation of the 1949 armistice line between Egypt and Israel, which rendered the Gaza Strip even far narrower than the Gaza district, the old Gaza district under the British mandate. Many of the refugees who flooded into Gaza came from towns and villages in southern and central Palestine and from northern parts as far as Galilee, but most of the refugees came from towns and villages around Gaza, and therefore had to endure the painful spectacle of being displaced within sight of their lost homes and lands. The paradoxical fate of Gaza was that at a time when other Palestinian cities witnessed a mass exodus of refugees, Gaza was experiencing a great influx of them. Gaza was a rare case of internally displaced people who became lifetime refugees. Israel, on the other hand, became the only country in modern memory that uprooted its refugees, then followed them, chased them to the camps, occupied them, besieged them, massacred them, and humiliated them for 7 decades. Where on earth, where else did this happen? This includes 2 occupations, a 50-year-old military rule that's still effectively in place, endless military raids and offenses, 12 full-scale wars, including 3 in the past decade alone, a 3-decade closure, which started in the early 90s, not 11 years ago, and an 11-year blockade by sea, land, and air with no end in sight. Languishing under siege, the refugees of Gaza came to realize the depth of their tragedy. There is one thing worse than displacement, and that is not being able to leave. Besides, one of the lessons of the Nakba was that for the people of Gaza, leaving would amount to permanent exile and second displacement. This rendered Gaza the largest open-air prison in the world, with 2 million people, the majority of whom refugees. In a bitter irony, this steadfastness of refugees coincides with UN reports describing Gaza under siege as unlivable. There's a popular saying in Israel that if you don't like it, go to Gaza, which embodies a cynical admission that Gaza is indeed unlivable by Israelis. And so the Gaza Strip, as it stands today, was an Israeli creation whose fate was sealed in the heat of war 70 years ago. In the 7 decades that followed, the gates of Gaza were slammed shut on its displaced population. Its impoverished and overcrowded refugee camps became permanent. The real tragedy, as the March of Return reminds us, was not the flight of refugees to Gaza, but not allowing them to return to their homes, a policy which Israel has pursued ruthlessly. The irony is that even when most refugees in Gaza started to move from tents to more solid houses, this movement, in fact, further exacerbated their bleak sense of permanent exile and displacement. And since its creation, the spectacle of refugee camps in Gaza has haunted the Israeli leadership, whose unending obsession with the refugee population should explain their aggressive policy toward Gaza over the past decades. It should also explain why Israel continues to view impoverished and powerless Gaza as a security threat of existential proportions that require extraordinary and disproportionate measures. To give you a few examples from history, Israel's founders, like David Ben-Gurion, foresaw the risk of concentrating tens of thousands of refugees in their backyard, squeezing them in a tiny coastal strip straddled between the Negev and Sinai, where the natural obstacle of the desert prevented their dispersion, like other refugees. And fearing the spectacle of waves of refugees marching from Israel on Gaza, the early Israeli leadership set its mind on eliminating the refugee population of Gaza. In November 1956, during the Suez crisis, it was Israel who marched into Gaza. And starting with 2 military raids on the refugee camps there, Israel's first occupation of Gaza, which lasted for 4 months, culminated in 2 massacres in Khan Yunis and Rafah camps. The human cost was so alarmingly high, it prompted the head of a special UN observer mission in Gaza at the time to link the killings to Israel's obsession and intention to get rid of the refugee population in Gaza. This is not me saying that. This is a UN special observer. And this could apply to Israel attacks on Gaza, especially in 1914, which culminated in the death of over 1,000 Palestinians. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who visited Gaza in 1967, was appalled by the sight of refugee camps there. That month, he told an Israeli politician that, quote, "The refugee camps I have seen will be a heavy burden on Israel's future." This was a foresighted observation on Sartre's part, though it was also a belated realization, since the refugee camps had already hunted Israel for 2 decades since 1948. Now, the refugee population of Gaza continued to hunt the Israeli leadership after 1967. Transfer plans abounded. During the subsequent prolonged Israeli occupation of Gaza in 1967, which painfully placed Gaza refugees under the control of the very forces that had uprooted them 2 decades before, Israeli politicians contemplated transferring Gaza refugees to the West Bank or Sinai or an Arab country in North Africa, including the so-called Libyan operation. They even hatched a secret plan named the Moshe Dayan Plan to transfer refugees to Latin America by air. But fortunately for the people of Gaza, the plan was deemed costly and impractical. Thank God. Like war, peace also proved costly for the refugees of Gaza, thanks to the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt in 1979. For one thing, the peace agreement reinforced the old international Egypt-Palestine frontier of 1906, dividing families by barbed wires, causing further population displacement and house demolitions along the newly demarcated border, and depriving Gaza's fishermen of the traditional access to Egyptian territorial waters. One tragic outcome of Camp David was the destruction that Israel moved its settlements from Sinai to Gaza. No wonder the first Palestinian uprising, Intifada, which broke out in 1987, originated in the Jabalia refugee camp, nicknamed Vietnam Camp. The uprising was led by young Palestinians who grew up under Israeli occupation. Hamas was the product of the first Intifada. Remember, also 2 of the 3 founders of the PLO were from Gaza. But the most important thing about the first Intifada that it was a living reminder that rather than eliminating the refugee population of Gaza, Israel's endless offenses have only enhanced the solidarity between the urban population of Gaza and its refugee population. This applies also to the second Intifada, when Gaza became the symbolic battlefield of the uprising after the Israeli soldiers shot a 19-year-old Muhammad Durra in his father's arm, making him the iconic figure of the uprising near the Burej refugee camp in Gaza. And finally, in 2005, and after nearly 4 decades of prolonged occupation, Israel withdrew from Gaza, leaving behind some 1 million camped refugees, believing it had swept the refugee crisis under the rug of disengagement. In reality, Israel's unilateral withdrawal made the refugee population an easy target for its military incursions, with entire sections now of the refugee camps were declared no-go areas for the Israeli soldiers. At the same time, the Israeli withdrawal was widely branded as having fulfilled Israel's obligations toward Gaza and its refugees. In the meantime, Israel continued to control Gaza by air, land, and sea, while declaring the Strip a hostile territory, subject to continued military operations and collective punishment. In withdrawing, Israel realized that it would be easier and cheaper to run the prison from the outside than from the inside. This was evident from the fact that all Palestinians who were killed during the March of Return were killed inside Gaza, within the Israeli-imposed buffer zone that cuts deep into Gaza territory and covers a third of its arable land. So Israel was not defending its border, it was defending its buffer zones. And Gaza is not a state bordering Israel. It's an occupied territory. The UN still considers Gaza an occupied territory because Israel still has effective control over Gaza. My main take is that without understanding the crisis in Gaza as a refugee crisis, we cannot understand why Israel continues to deny the people of Gaza to live in dignity and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Assi. We now would like to open up the conversation to the floor for questions. We'd ask that you would keep your comments concise, and I'd invite the panelists if you have questions for one another too. We hope that the preliminary comments will serve as a foundation for our conversation as we talk about the ongoing and continued displacement of the Palestinian people. Dr. Pape.
There we go. Okay, thank you. A question to Itay. Maybe Suhad and Seraje would like to comment on this as well. Itay, you brought a very interesting concept of a permanent occupation. It sounds to me like an oxymoron, like a Jewish democracy or purity of arms. I don't understand what a permanent occupation is. Israel occupied parts of the United Nations Arab state in 1948, and that permanent occupation continued for 19 years, first until 67. Actually, it's 70 years old. Don't you think it's much better to use a different term, because permanent occupation doesn't mean much? And we probably have to resort to a term that may sound outdated, but seems the best one we have, unless, of course, someone can come up with something better, which is colonization. And this would also explain the ideological context in which the kind of things you have described, Itay, have been done and are going to be done in the West Bank, namely, it is in the nature of a settler colonialist movement, not only in Palestine, elsewhere in the world, to try and get as much of the space as possible with as few of the native indigenous people as possible. So the question is there a legal framework in 2018 to deal with colonialism, with settler colonialism, which is the main and probably the only reason for the dispossession of the Palestinian people? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pape. It's a very deserving question indeed. I think perhaps warrants an entire panel. But let me try and respond. I think you're right in saying there is no such thing as a permanent occupation. I would subscribe to that view in the sense that the law of belligerent occupation, well, there is no time cap on belligerent occupation. That was never envisaged in drafting the Fort Geneva Convention. But nor was this intended as a permanent state of affair. In fact, if you look at the jus contra bellum, not at the jus in bellum, if you look at the jus contra bellum, the prohibition on acquisition of territory, the prohibition on annexation is designed to defeat that exactly. It is designed to defeat conquest and colonization. That is the purpose of that prohibition. Within international humanitarian law, you don't have that safeguard. So I would say, or I would argue, one way of looking at this is devising a test for a substantive cap on occupation. And I'm not saying something that hasn't been heard in these chambers before last year, and I think this was mentioned perhaps earlier today or as part of deliberations yesterday. The report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Occupied Palestinian Territory, Professor Link. And last year he devised a test to define an illegal occupant. And the essence of that test is when an occupation crosses a threshold from something that is provisional, that is temporary, and that much is enshrined in international humanitarian law, into something that is intended to be permanent and irremovable, then the occupant is not just not discharging its duties in good faith. I think we're past that point of taking stock of the numerous violations that Israel has committed in the course of conducting occupation. No, it's about the intent. The intent is to annex. The intent is to hold on to this permanently. And the intent is to use occupation or the facade of occupation to mask, and I think on that I would agree, to mask its real intent, which is acquisition or colonization of Palestinian territory and the denial of Palestinians' right to self-determination. This is what it is intended to accomplish. I think from there we need to progress or graduate to the question of how do we address and reverse that, and there are perhaps some options that we can come back to, but maybe Suhad will have some more thoughts on this.
And I'd like to add an addendum as well. It was mentioned in the morning panel about the U.S. policy's shift, particularly in the Human Rights Report, on the addressing of the territories as being occupied. My understanding is occupation or occupied Palestinian territory used to be in the title of the Human Rights Report. Our team went through and read this year's Human Rights Report, and there's only 5 mentions of occupation at all. And my question is, are there implications for that as well, in light of this question about whether or not there's such a thing as a permanent occupation, or if a different terminology should be used? So yes, please, Suhad.
Okay, thank you. Again, building on Elan's question and my 4-puzzle picture, because of lack of time, I will address this now in response also. And there is very clear ideological principal themes that Israel is manifesting through its policy vis-a-vis the Palestinian people and the historic Palestine geographically. That is the supremacy of the one nation from the river to the sea, extended sovereignty on stages, of course, segregation and demographic engineering. If you compile all of those components as reality tells, I think you reach to a conclusion that you are drawing. Now, we need to be careful also on this sense, because there is an ideological theme, very strong ideological theme in Israeli policies, whether you want to call it settler colonialism or any other kind of colonialism, that needs to be addressed also in how we construct and reconstruct this system as such. Vis-a-vis the Palestinian rights to self-determination, that includes the West Bank and Gaza, that includes the Palestinians in Israel, and certainly the Palestinian refugees. Concerning the U.S., it's not surprising, of course, and to me, it doesn't mean much in terms of the text. What it really means, it's the implications of the U.S. policy. I can't say it's new, but how it was translated in the recent, in the past few weeks. And we have seen in response massive as a result of unconditioned support. Massive attempts by Israeli policymakers, lawmakers, decision makers, ministers, towards annexation and building up on further annexations, depriving people severe human rights and violations of IHL. In Israel itself, we are also, as Palestinians, feeling it more severely. They are now discussing what's known as the bill, the basic law of the Jewish Israel as a Jewish nation state, which again brings to a constitutional normative framework the supremacy, the segregation on basis of nationality and religion, and so on and so on. Yeah, so it's beyond practices. It's beyond whether it's Netanyahu or someone else sitting as a prime minister. It's maintaining, its sustainability of this supremacy through a constitutional framework that will be much harder to change whether Netanyahu will be elected next elections or not.
Seraje, and then we'll have Itay, and then we'll take your question.
Well, Israel has ruled the West Bank and Gaza for a half century, which is more than twice as long as it lived within the Green Line. Now, since occupation is a temporary condition, Israel's prolonged occupation has become colonial in character. It seizes land and resources for the benefits of its own citizens, transfers settlers, displaces natives, substantially altering the demographic landscape and the legal system of the occupied territory, and therefore denying the native population meaningful self-government and civil rights. Israel has also created a dual legal system in which people's rights depend on their ethnic identity. Now, sooner or later, Israel will have to choose between a Palestinian state existing alongside Israel or ruling over 7 million Palestinians in an apartheid-style regime. Now, the Israeli leadership seems to be under the impression that since occupation could be sustained for 50 years, perhaps Israel could do the same with an apartheid regime. Perhaps in Israel's case, because Israel is very exceptional, apartheid would prove durable, unlike South Africa. I doubt. Now, I don't think colonial or colonialism has a legal value. That's why we insist on the category of occupation, because until a final solution is reached, Israel needs to assume its obligations as an occupying power under international law, which includes the protection of individual civilians under its control. Now, the UN still, as I said, considers Gaza as an occupied territory because Israel still has effective control over it. But since the international community has not demanded that Israel pay its fair share in Gaza, and because the costs of Israeli occupation are largely paid by others, especially including the international community, Israeli leaders lack any concrete incentive to alter their reckless and deeply entrenched policies in Gaza. Therefore, I think one main looking forward, one main step is shifting our efforts from grand solutions to the conflict, like one state, two states, or three states, to more pressing questions of justice, equality, and human and civil rights. This includes, most importantly, shifting the narrative from the two-state paradigm to one that demands an immediate end to the occupation. Now, this paradigm is more effective because it asserts that Israel's withdrawal from occupied Palestinian territories is not a concession, is not a political demand or a concession, but an obligation under international law, which stems from the inalienable rights of Palestinians, notably the right to self-determination. Also, for both Palestinians and the international community, the validity of this new paradigm stems from the fact that the current Israeli government does not share their vision of a two-state solution. It has never done, including with respect to borders, settlement, withdrawal, Jerusalem, etc. Now, Also, the majority of Israelis do not believe that there is such a thing as occupation. That's also a problem, which creates some sort of a disconnection between the international discourse on Israel and the national discourse inside Israel. Now, but as former UN Secretary Kofi Annan said, can Israel be right and the whole world wrong? Another related problem is that the Israeli leadership seems to be swinging between two narratives that are basically contradictory. One is domestic, which refers to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria and claims it as part of Greater Israel. This is in the charter of the Likud party, of Prime Minister Netanyahu's party. And the other is international, which claims that Israel has no effective control over the West Bank or Gaza, and hence is not subject to the international law of occupation. So which one exactly, which narrative are you going to present before us? So this duplicity is one of the reasons why occupation is still, going on. Thank you for this.
So maybe just to complement that with a brief comment on the U.S. stance. I don't recognize the U.S. in the room, but perhaps Ambassador Haley can catch this online. Who knows? Let me say this. One, there's the U.S. position on what is customary international law and what is binding upon the U.S. Those of you who have been here for many years recall that when Ambassador Bolton served, he had a bit of a crusade to say that Security Council resolutions were not binding unless the text of the resolution reads that they were adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And I think we can stack mile high the number of scholars that would say that it could say that, but doesn't have to say that for it to have normative and binding power. And the U.S., like all other member states, is bound by Security Council resolutions. And I think Ambassador Bolton has maintained his crusade in his current capacity. When it comes to the question of Palestine, or the question of Israel, rather, the U.S., and I'm unfortunately not in a possession of a crystal ball, but let me do a bit of a prediction here. I'm willing to go on a limb, simply because elements of its peace plan are already out. One is Jerusalem. They have already unilaterally arbitrated this. They've denied the corpus separatum. They've denied the possibility of Palestinian sovereignty and its occupied parts in East Jerusalem, and they've favored the whole of Jerusalem to Israel. And Jerusalem is off the table. They have done that with Palestine refugees. The UNRWA defunding is not about the level of service to Palestine refugees. I don't dismiss that. That is of significance. It is about negating the status of Palestine refugees. It is about negating the durable solution, which is either return, repatriation, return to their homes in safety and dignity, or compensation. It is about disqualifying them as Palestine refugees, as refugees. And finally, this is going back to the map I showed just now. It is the recognition of Israeli annexation of settlement blocks, and this will come shortly. There will be a pronouncement from the White House, and President Trump will say that he simply recognizes the fait accompli, the facts on the ground. And the facts are that Israel, through its de facto practical measures of expanding settlements, of consolidating settlement blocks, through de jure legislative measures and initiatives, have already annexed 62% of the West Bank. And that will be recognized by the U.S. And finally, there will be final irreversible severance of Gaza from the West Bank. So in that sense, the U.S. will contribute to the permanency of Israeli domination, control, call it occupation or not.
Yes, please.
Microphone, please.
Of course, we all have watched the atrocities that happened, that 68 people were murdered in Palestine. I started meditating on how do we hold our government accountable to its aiding and abetting with human rights abuses, sort of connecting the dots, and also I believe it's Article 148 that comes from the Human Rights Council, holding governments accountable to racism. So are there ways that we can connect holding our government accountable to its racism and how white supremacy played its part in the atrocities that happened on Monday, and its aiding and abetting an occupied agenda?
I'm looking at our panelists about who would like to respond. I will speak as an American and as a citizen. I think that our policies vis-a-vis Palestine are atrocious. And I believe that many Americans are quite ignorant of a way that U.S. policies affect realities on the ground in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. At the same time as we're advocating for justice for one people group, I do not want us to perpetuate injustice against another, but I don't think that we can use that as an excuse to not act. So our commitment is to raise awareness, to seek to educate, to elevate the voices of those who are committed to peace. I think one of the elements that was talked about this morning on the first panel was that there are not two sides to this conflict, Israelis and Palestinians. There are two sides to this conflict, those who are working for peace and justice and those who are not. And so we want to redefine the binary that is so incredibly present in the United States. I would argue that advocating for justice for the Palestinians is necessary from a human rights perspective, that it's necessary from a historical perspective, but I also would suggest if you care at all about the future of Israel and the Jewish people of Israel and the Israeli state, you have to care for Palestinians as well. And so I think part of our responsibility as, for myself, an American citizen, is to not only educate, but to advocate for just policies in that regard. Ambassador Itay.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I feel tempted, and I took it you meant the U.S. government. Okay, so let me first address another government, the government of Israel, because the obligation to respect and ensure respect for international law has an internal dimension. First and foremost, it is up to Israel to respect international law. That includes international humanitarian and human rights law. There is also an external dimension that you were alluding to, the obligation to ensure respect by others. And that is shared by all in this room. There is an obligation of third states to ensure respect by others. There's a communal interest in ensuring respect for international law. Has the government of Israel failed to respect international law? Unfortunately, the answer to that is yes. Have third states failed in ensuring respect, in impressing upon Israel that it has to respect international law? Unfortunately, the answer to that is also yes. However, it is an obligation of means, not of result. And by that, I mean that Israel may persistently continue to violate the rights of Palestinians. But the test that we have to prescribe to is whether or not states in this room, outside this room, are doing everything in their power. are the measures that they are devising effective? Are they doing everything within their power? And obviously different states have different leverage with an erring state like Israel. Again, assuming you're referring to the government of the United States, it enjoys an immense leverage with Israel, which not only that it does not leverage to ensure respect, that in fact gives license to violate international law. So, and by doing so, it becomes in a better in these violations. How do you hold both Israel and third states, including the United States, accountable? Maybe we'll come back to that later this afternoon.
I see several questions. We'll now take two at a time. Ambassador Mansour.
Thank you. Also, like what I did in the morning, we want to thank all of you, the panelists, and my friend, the vice chair of the committee, on behalf of the committee, for having this very important panel and for the very useful information shared with us by the panelists. And we thank you very much for all the work that you do in advancing justice for the Palestinian people. I have two subjects that I want to raise. One, hopefully, is short. To my brother, Seraje, I think that your fascinating paper with regard to concentrating on Gaza, I think it is also applicable in terms of the concentration of refugees in other parts of the West Bank. For example, if you take Jericho, at that time, it was from a small town, it was inflated to 100,000 refugees, particularly in Aqba Jabr refugee camp. So I think what is applicable, to the Gaza Strip can be also extended to other parts of the occupied territory. One can mention, Jericho, Nablus, for example, with other cities that were relatively small became big cities because of the influx of refugees. So I think that your analysis, although you concentrated that in Gaza, perhaps because of the events that we are going through for the last month and a half, could be very much applicable, to the other parts of the occupied Palestine, not even to mention the large refugee camps in Yarmouk, in Jordan, in Lebanon, which they have different, situation. The other point that I totally agree with you is also regarding the focus should be on occupation. And the reason why on occupation, because as you correctly have also indicated, and as also Sha'wan reminded us earlier in the morning, that international law, particularly international humanitarian law, is the invention of the Europeans as a derivative of what happened, particularly during World War II, in order to regulate in a quote-unquote civilized way of how the occupiers deal with the people who live and the countries that live under occupation. And they regulated that concepts into known, accepted modes of conduct as international law. So therefore, I think that we should concentrate on that. Of course, there is a tradition, especially in this room, of putting into colonization. But, settler colonialism, I don't think that there has been articulation of laws to address that issue. Now, this is an introduction, the preliminary paragraphs, to what I want to come to as a second subject. I think that this concept of prolonged occupation emerged with people with good intentions for a specific purpose. It did not start with Mr. Link, although he gave us a presentation here last year, but one can trace it back to Mr. John Dugard. Because John Dugard and those who followed him, including Link, were seeking with good intentions methods of using international law and the legal option of trying to isolate the occupation further. So they were suggesting ideas, noble ideas, practical ideas, not abstract ideas, of how international law and the legal option can be utilized to use it against occupation. Their objective of prolonged occupation, because they believe that international humanitarian law was constructed on the basis that occupation is a temporary phenomenon. Therefore, it has to end within a certain period of time. So their assumption now, the Israeli occupation now, it is 50 years old, 51 years old. It is way too long. It is not a temporary phenomenon. So their discussion on ideas to convince us and to convince others that perhaps we should articulate a question in the General Assembly to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice, with what would be the legal ramification of a prolonged occupation. Not to only have an abstract discussion of the subject, but for a very specific focus. And they were hoping, if that is to happen, and we are engaging them in order really that this issue is not a simple issue, it is a very complicated issue. And if you want to go that route, and we are considering that route, you want to make sure that you will succeed in this exercise, because the objective is to use it as a tool of struggle, not only just to prove a point for legal scholars in the legal field. So their objective, if we reach that moment of succeeding in articulating a question to the ICJ in the General Assembly, and the General Assembly to examine it, their expectation that this is not a temporary occupation, this is a prolonged occupation, therefore it has to end, mandatory, whether you negotiate or not. That is their objective, which I think is a noble objective. It has a purpose. It is not only, to argue what is the use of prolonged occupation or short occupation. It is within that context of building another, front for us to really combat this occupation. But again, the focus is occupation. And that occupation has to end. And also, of course, to my friend, to my brother from Gaza, you cannot talk about ending occupation without linking it to the independence of the State of Palestine. Because we're not going to end occupation and then, to have it, just, nothing. You end occupation, we exercise the right of self-determination along with other components of the Palestinian people, including those in the 1948. Because when we struggle and legislate, as I told my friend Ellen Pape, we are in the business here, the delegation of the State of Palestine, of legislating every year, 16 resolutions, 13 of them of a political nature, and all of them revolve around the attainment of the inalienable national rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, to statehood, which means end of occupation, and the right of the refugees to return on the basis of 194. These resolutions, some people might say, including Bolton, when I first came to assume my post, he was the ambassador. And he crusaded to negate all of our resolutions. And when he failed and failed miserably, he told the media the reason why these resolutions are meaningless. So then I said to the media at that time, if they are meaningless, why did you campaign for 15 days with all states to negate these resolutions? These resolutions are not meaningless. They are part of international law, and we are in the business of upholding international law, and they mean something. They are important, and these are the details of the components of the inalienable national rights of the Palestinian people. And this is one of the remarkable things about the UN. Although we are not succeeding in ending occupation, although we are not succeeding in the independence of our state yet, and we are not succeeding in the return of the refugees, but we are succeeding in the maintenance, in a legal frame of the details of the components of the national rights of the Palestinian people. So therefore, ending occupation, it is a derivative or connected with a state, with the independence of the state of Palestine. But again, with regard to that issue of prolonged occupation, we need to look at it as a component of expanding our front for struggling against occupation, and any idea of that nature to move us from the abstract to the practical, to the concrete, I think it serves the cause of the Palestinian people in the best possible way. Thank you.
Vice Chair Iwanez would like to respond.
I will say quickly a few words because I want to leave the people here sufficient time to air their views. I think, taking the cue from what my brother Riyad said, I think it's a very dangerous path if we label this as colonization. Surely, from a political perspective, humbly I say in this building, it is not very much favorable to the Palestinian cause. It's a occupation, and we have to stick to the occupation and a long-term occupation. Precisely, there's a difference as well. I think there's a difference, a stark and refined difference that in terms of colonialization, the colonial power came from another country, came and occupied another. In this case, it is not a colonial power which came, a new state has established, and it's established on the land which belongs not to theirs. So this is my opinion. The second thing I would like to refer to the gentleman there quickly about whether racism, etc., color issue, etc. I think, the end result is the same. The effects of racism is the same, but I think it's more a choice between a Jewish state and a democratic state. And basically, I personally believe that Israel has long put away the idea of a two-state solution. Long ago, they believed in a one-state solution. Then they realized that in the one-state solution, they have to make a stark choice between being democratic and being Jewish. And the actions show that now they don't care about democratic principles anymore, but they are on the path for Jewishness, whatever it takes. Thank you.
We'll now take questions. Suwan Jabrin.
Thank you for the panels.
Excuse me, yes, Suwan, and then Phyllis, you'll be next.
Thank you for the panelists for rich presentations. I will not go in academic and theoretical legal discussion. And I would like just to address a few things. One, I do believe that within the frame of occupation, you can address also colonialization and also apartheid. Here I'm speaking about practices with the frame of occupation, because I don't think that the main intention behind the idea of Mr. Link and also John Doggart only how to find the ways to address the ending of occupation. I think it's about the nature of the Israeli policies and the practices. It's an ordinary occupation. That's what we have to emphasize on. What's going on the ground, when you speak about two different ethnic groups, one of them is illegal, their staying is illegal, and you have two different legal regimes implemented on them, what you can call it. This is when you speak about special roads for specific ethnic group and other roads for the others, what you can call it. The third one is about natural resources. When you speak about that Israel taking all the natural resources for their use, for their interest, and they don't leave anything for the people under the occupation, the protected persons. What do you call it? That's here when it comes to the international humanitarian law, it's illegal. And also, according to the international humanitarian law, it's a pillage, which it's amount to war crime according to the International Criminal Court statute. That's an issue, Just if you go in details about the Israeli practices, the Israeli policies, that's the case. I think it's not enough just to address that by saying this is an ordinary occupation. That's an issue. And this is a question. This is a question for academics, and I would like here to draw your attention to really an academic piece of work under the title called Beyond Occupation, Colonialism, and Apartheid. John Dugart was one of the editors. And our organization and the Adala organization also, they participated in that piece of work. This is a very important thing. Another thing is, I think Israel, it has a special nature. It's not like South Africa, and it's not like any other one. One, it's depopulated policies. That's the main issue that they have. When they impose, let me say, physical restrictions here or there, or administrative measures or economic measures, they have long-term plan to push people outside of their land. That's the case. This is the main aim behind that. They do that in a very sophisticated way. They do that in a very quiet way. This is the case, the forcible transfer of Palestinians within the occupied territory or outside of the occupied territory, and transfer Israeli civilians to the occupied territory. That's the case. Because of that, I think it needs to study this one. It's not just for theoretical things, it's not a fashionable things, but also when we said that this is a case, it's a test for everything. When we say apartheid, it's beyond apartheid. When the South Africans visit Palestine, they said, no, this is beyond that. It's worse than what we used to have in South Africa. That's the case. And I think it needs to study that and to discuss, the practices. But I agree that within the frame of occupation, I think we can speak about that. It's not just foreign countries imposing here, there. It's not just that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question from Phyllis, and then we'll have the panel respond.
Colleague who raised the question about accountability to from the United States and the obligations both of civil society globally as well as in the U.S. and here in the United Nations. Because I think there is a way, while there are massive differences between the South African and Israeli versions of apartheid, they both stand in violations of the International Covenant against apartheid, and there are things we can learn from the anti-apartheid movement. One that I think is important that is already underway in the U.S. and that gives us, if there is any optimism right now, gives us a little bit of hope, which is the intersectional nature of movements across the U.S., movements against racism, movements for women's rights, movements for environmental justice. All of the various social movements are taking up the question of Palestinian rights. Part of it has to do with what is the impact in the United States of the U.S. policy that enables and finances Israeli occupation, Israeli apartheid, etc. The U.S. now gives $3.8 billion a year to Israel in direct military aid, every year. That's $3.8 billion of our tax money. Imagine what that money could go for in the United States, where 140 million people are either living in poverty or low income, where a third, I think it is, of U.S. children don't have enough to eat. So in that context, the amount of money goes directly to the question of what is the consequence in the United States. There's the issue of collaboration on military and police training between the U.S. and Israel, where policies and training methods that rely on identifying people as potential criminals, potential terrorists, racial profiling in both countries, collaborate with each other, those training methods come back to the United States and impact particularly communities of people of color, black and brown communities. So when we talk about what can happen at the United Nations, I think it's important that we recognize that here at the United Nations there is a great deal of fear among many, many countries, many governments, who are afraid to challenge the United States. They might like to challenge Israeli policies, but are not willing to take the risk of what the consequence might be when the United States comes back and threatens to cut aid, cut their trade privileges, etc. So the question for us in the United States, and this is, I think, both for the U.S. population as a whole, and particularly for those of us who are Jewish, to take on in a very direct way the question of consequences of U.S. support for the Israeli military, which amounts to, as I believe the figure is, about 20% of the IDF budget in that $38 billion. So when we think about it in that context, we can look at some models that happened here, and I'll just close with a remembrance. When the struggle against apartheid was at its height, much of it was being raised at the United Nations long before the United States government was prepared to challenge apartheid. It did at the end, when it was dragged kicking and screaming. But here at the United Nations, countries were prepared to, for example, refuse to sell arms to South Africa. It's possible we could imagine countries refusing to buy arms from Israel. Not too many countries sell arms to Israel. Israel produces most of its own and buys the rest from the United States. But Israel sells an enormous amount of weapons and military systems. It sells an enormous amount of police equipment. If countries decided on their own, through discussion at the UN, how could that work, it would play an enormous role in making the occupation and its military component far more difficult. If the UN were to consider rebuilding the old Center Against Apartheid that was unfortunately allowed to lapse, we would have a new set of resources that could work with civil society to build those movements against the new version of apartheid that so many around the world are already challenging. So I think there are a lot of possibilities. And again, as we've heard from so many of our wonderful speakers, we have to be thinking outside the box and think creatively about some new strategies and new tactics to take on this struggle.
Thank you. I'd like to provide the opportunity for our panel to respond. We'll begin with Suhad.
I know there's a lot of hesitance about the colonial or settler colonial paradigm, but I think if we speak about it in the sense of its rationale and essence, it's unavoidable, and I think it can compass a lot of what's happening, including the occupation and so on and so on. And the decolonization process is certainly a challenging one, also in terms of West Bank, Gaza, Israel itself, and the refugees. But we need to be more creative in this sense. And it's much easier to go to the direction where there is an international consensus and international legitimacy of saying there should be a Palestinian state, two-state solutions, and Israel not addressing its character, which is very problematic, and I will address that now. A Jewish and democratic state is not working at all. Being a Palestinian citizen of Israel, the Jewish state means to me demographic engineering, means to me revoking of citizenship on the basis of non-loyalty. It means to me a displacement for the sake of building Jewish towns and villages. It means to be forestation by GNF and thus displacement. It means to me ban of family unification. It means to be limitations on commemorating the Nakba. yeah, by law. It means to me segregation. It means to me that if there is a Palestinian political party, of any political party in Israel, that calls for full democratic state, for full rights of all of its citizens, cannot run to the elections by Israeli constitutional law. Yeah. Not to speak that there is no Israeli nationality. The Supreme Court in Israel already ruled 2 times at least, as far as I remember, that there is no Israeli nationality. I mean, Jewish citizens of Israel addressed the Supreme Court saying, we are Israeli nationals. And the Israeli Supreme Court said, under Israeli law, there is no such a thing. You have Jewish, you have Arab, not Palestinians, of course, because they do not recognize that, but you might have multiple, but not Israeli nationality. So it's not there. The democratic part of the name is not working, is not functioning. Of course, we have freedom of movement, we can elect to the Knesset, we can vote, and so on and so on. And in many aspects, yes. But to the essence of these practices, vis-a-vis me as a citizen, I'm a Palestinian. And I cannot practice democracy on many levels of my day-to-day life. And I'm still seen as a threat. And I'm still seen as Palestinian, and any case brought to the Israeli Supreme Court, and including the perspective of the political system, of course, because it reflects. My constitutional rights are suspended to the level of checking what my Palestinian nationality means vis-a-vis these constitutional rights. And this is not democracy. This is not how democracy functions. So there is a huge contradiction, and it's not symbolic. Yeah, we tend to refer to the Israel as a Jewish state as a symbolic thing that has nothing to do with its democratic so-called character. But it affects my day-to-day life. If I tomorrow marry to a spouse from Ramallah, we cannot live in Israel. Yeah. So there is a huge contradiction that any process of resolving the Palestinian issue, decolonization or whatever, needs to address also, among the rest of the important issues, also this issue.
I see 3 questions. Itay will respond, and then we'll take the 3 questions that are on the floor.
But recognizing that recognizing that there are many questions, I'll try and be brief in my response to this. Let's work back from the end of occupation. What constitutes an end of occupation? One thing is that the withdrawal of foreign troops is insufficient to end occupation. What you need to qualify as an end of occupation is the reversal, is the restoration of the rightful sovereign effectively controlling that territory. And that translates into the realization of the right to self-determination. That is what ending occupation means. There is no vacuum. So I would certainly prescribe to what Ambassador Mansour has said. In terms of an ICJ advisory or the possibility of an ICJ advisory opinion, I agree, and this has a bit of a legacy with Mr. Dugard and with Professor Falk, and more recently with Professor Link and other scholars that have looked at this. I believe the essence of this is looking, it's a 2-pronged approach. One is looking at the excesses or the abuses of occupation. Israeli occupation is an abusive occupation, not in line with the duties that are prescribed by the law of occupation. Its prolongation speaks to the intent, speaks to the intent to transform it into a form of aggression, of conquest. And I think this should probably constitute part of the question referred to the ICJ, in at least in theory. Is it an occupation that has somehow metastasized into a form of aggression? But I don't think we should stop there. I think, yeah. I don't think we should stop there. I think the question is, what ways and means should the member states of this institution of the United States resort to fulfill their obligation to ensure respect for international law, and that includes, in relation to the prolongation and abuses of occupation, the duty of non-recognition, and the duty to cooperate to bring an end to a wrongful situation, and indeed the duty to investigate, prosecute grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, but also to suppress a violation of the jus contra bellum, of the law that prevents aggression. I think if there is a way for us to conceptualize all of these and address that through the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice, I think the result will be not just a theoretical academic exercise, but would actually expand the reservoir, the arsenal of measures at the disposal of state to bring this to an end. And again, let me stress, bringing an occupation to an end means restoring the rightful sovereign in Palestine.
Seraje.
Ambassador Mansour, of course, I'm not an anarchist. I do believe that statehood is the best guarantee for human and civil rights in our time. We don't have any other framework. I also believe that human rights or human rights demands and statehood aspirations are not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary. And I do join your call on Western governments and member states to recognize the state of Palestine. Like parliaments, the French lawmakers already voted for recognizing the state of Palestine, following other similar moves in Britain and Spain, but the government need to follow suit on that. I focus on ending the occupation because this is at the root of civil society activism, whose core mission is to question the notion that governments should have total monopoly and control over people's destiny and future. So if the governments won't change their behavior, it is up to the people to step in and force them to do so. Now, speaking of the U.S. role, I have a few things. For many Palestinians, the embassy move is a reminder of the Balfour Declaration, when a foreign government promised Palestine to another people. In other words, with the embassy move, Palestine has been thrice promised by God, the British, and Donald J. Trump. But my question, are Palestinians doomed and fated to see their destiny determined by foreigners? Now, one more thing about U.S. role. I think one significant step or one thing to do is to sue your government. Tell your government that your embassy is built on stolen Palestinian land on an illegal settlement in Jerusalem. It is an illegal outpost. This is the only way to describe the embassy, where 40% of the Palestinians of Jerusalem are separated from the city by a separation wall, including Al-Quds University, which is also behind the wall. This is your tax money. Also, speaking of tax money, the U.S. government, led by Donald Trump, announced recently that it would slash its support to UNRWA by more than 50%, almost $300 million, while also eliminated about $50 million food program for the people of Gaza. This is your tax money. Call on your representatives, your congressmen, senators. Tell them, okay, I don't want my tax money to go to the occupiers in forms of sales, arms sales. I want my tax money to go to the refugees. So the U.S., what we have seen also in Jerusalem recently was a brutal contrast of two realities. Like on one side of the border, you have people celebrating and partying with toast for peace and international delegations and lavish galas. On the other side, across the border, just 50 miles away, people were murdered in cold blood gunned down in broad daylight. In other words, the U.S. was rewarding Israel for massacring, besieging, and killing Palestinians in Gaza. This is the only way to describe it. Now also, one last thing, speaking of U.S. rule. Over the past decade, the international community has conceded its rule to the United States on the hope that Washington would use its leverage to pressure Israel toward more flexibility. This never happened. And in light of the demise of U.S. rule in Palestine, in the conflict, I mean, there's a vacuum created by an opening for the international community and this international body, actually, to renew its effort to advance peace in Palestine. Now, I find it absurd that the Israeli leadership dismisses this international body as biased toward Palestinians when Israel owes its very existence to the United Nations. The reason that the promise of Palestinian statehood remains unfulfilled is because only half of Resolution 181 was implemented. So, yeah.
The gentleman... The gentleman up in the... Yes, please.
Madame la Présidente, je voudrais...
Madam Chairman, firstly, I should like to congratulate the panelists. They have looked at the links between the past, present, and future. I'd just like to say a word or two about the past and the present, and then ask a question about the future. On the past, I think since this morning, talking about the origin of not the problem but the problems in the plural, we must acknowledge very humbly there is part of the conflict having sprung from dissidents. Judaism came from neo-Pharaonism. The Christianity came out of Judaism. We all know that. Islam, well, there's a degree of Christianity there. The Baha'i came from Islam. So, in a nutshell, there are certain confluences in our world throughout the continents, Asia, Europe, Africa. The Red Sea area is one that we bring with us. So when we look at the sacred text, Daniel, the Quran, it's the politicians who grasp the text. How are we going to get out of that? That's the past. Now to come to the present in Europe. Capitalism, imperialism, which gave rise to Nazism, fascism, apartheid. Goodness, this is an unsettled conflict. All these problems sprung out of the Second World War, the conflict. We have a European, Arturo Labriola, who put the problem very well. Europe in the world summarizes all the problems we have. So I would ask about this. 3 solutions now. Firstly, force, violence, but we're not going to discuss that here. When there's a problem, there are internal and external forces. History demonstrates that. Secondly, education. We talked about that this morning. I won't go back on that. UNESCO must help, etc. But there's a third solution, and this is where I come to the question I want to put. When there's a problem in Africa, there's exorcism, medical therapy, spiritual therapy. I want to ask, when it comes to religions, how far can they go? Can they continue? Can they tell us about interreligious dialogue? We've heard of Christians, Muslims, Jews speaking. Where are we in the debate to move forward? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll refer to the gentleman in the back who's... Yes. Yes, please.
Green. Oh, okay, now. Yes. It's working? Yeah, okay. So as a member of the Palestinian civil society, and more specifically the human rights community in Palestine, I'm witnessing that Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations are actually working hard to resist the Israeli measures causing the ongoing Nakba. I see that some organizations use litigation, others use documentation and reporting, others use international advocacy, or most of them use as well international advocacy. We make sometimes small minor successes here and there, small victories, but at large, I see also, and I think all of my colleagues from the human rights community would agree with me, that the regime is only getting from bad to worse, which means that we as a civil society, human rights community do not have the sufficient power to change or end this regime. At the same time, I can say that we witness that in general the international community is waiting for the resolution of the conflict. We are still in the framework of Palestinian state building, while we don't exactly know when the Palestinian free independent state, independent from occupation, is going to actually be a reality. So my question to the distinguished panelists is, are there any advice or recommendations you might want to give to the committee regarding their intervention in collaboration, hopefully, with the civil society in the future, and maybe also more generally, whether you have any recommendations for the United Nations and its interventions that maybe were, I'm sure the United Nations makes very important and very good interventions when it comes to human rights, but also if you have any comments to say about the state building framework and how versus simply the defense and survival, as well as addressing the regime much more clearly and much more in a much more stronger way. Do you have any comments? I would like to hear from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one additional question before inviting the panelists to respond. Yes, please.
Can you hear? Yes, okay, all right. Yeah, on international law, more than 2 decades ago, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, did deliver an opinion, actually, which states very clearly that the occupation is illegal. They stated in the opinion, the occupation is illegal, the wall is illegal, and so are the settlements. So that decision is there, but perhaps it is time, because that was in 1984, which is more than 2.5 decades ago. It is time probably to revisit that, and under the Charter, there's provision for the General Assembly to actually formulate a question to the ICJ, which sits at The Hague, for certain deliberations, and they could come up with a clearer decision as to the current status of the position. But there is an ICJ decision. I have done my LLM on this topic, so I'm very, very clear on this. But as I said, the decision is an opinion, and it's formulated on certain points. So it's probably time to revisit that in the light of the current situation. The other points that I would like the panel to deliberate upon are the further breaches, which they did mention under IHL. One is the disproportionate use of force. Lord Justice Goldstone provided that in his Goldstone report in Operation Cast-Lead. After Cast-Lead, there was a Goldstone report where the report very clearly states that Israel is in breach of disproportionate use of force and in breach of IHL. Further to that, this whole concept of preemptive strikes by Israel is not provided for under the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter does not provide for preemptive strikes. This is something which has been invented from thin air, and I think this is something that perhaps the General Assembly has to deal with in more detail. The third point is this. Israel is in further breach of the UN security resolutions. In 1948, there was a Security Council resolution, and in 1967. But of course, because of lack of political will, nothing further was done, and the occupation was allowed to go on from there after the Six-Day War. So perhaps the panel could go into that just a little bit more. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to begin?
Okay, I'm going to try to address as much as I can. Okay, I will begin from the last question. Dealing with Israel and its legal legacy in the OPTs specifically, it seems that Israel has been for a long time now is reconstructing the IHL in a way that it doesn't exist as an IHL anymore. For example, the recent events in Gaza saying that IHL or the law enforcement under IHL allows Israel to shoot live ammunition against civil unarmed demonstrators because Israel identifies them as major inciters, that's distortion. Again, might be suspension, but it's basically building upon a new school of interpretation of IHL that by itself violates. In the past, in 2003, they used Palestinians as human shields in their military operations in Jenin refugee camp and elsewhere. They came and said, it's not human shields. We know the human shields is forbidden under IHL, but we are taking the neighbor and asking for his help, which is something else, yeah? But again, these are just a few examples of how Israel takes this framework that says it voluntarily applies it on the West Bank and because it does not refer to it as an occupied territory. But, it re-cooks it into something that tastes afterward completely different, and it's not surprising. Concerning the religion, I'm Palestinian, and the issue is a national issue. And any reference to the conflict as a religious one, I think it's misrepresenting and misleading and will not get us anywhere. I'm a Palestinian. The problem with me is as Palestinian, although Israel tries to fragment it into religious ones. But the problem of Israel with me, not as a Christian, not as a Muslim, not as a Druze, but as a Palestinian. And we should think about it in this manner, think about the solution in this manner, and not in any other manner. The advisory opinion, of course, it's an advisory opinion, and it's one more decision that compiles into the dozens of UN resolutions and other decisions. It has its weight, and it's important, and it's unprecedented. But we should not build it. Has been over a decade now since the decision or the advisory was given, but and we refer to it in our legal documents, but its effect on the ground is not much seen. last words in this round, maybe referring also to two things, to Munir's. Our job is not easy, and it's becoming harder every day because ideological racism is becoming an issue of a rule of law. Totally. Because all of these racist practices are becoming laws. They are being enacted. It was much easier in the past to challenge legally racist, discriminatory policies. Now, enacting all of these sets of laws that basically validates these racist policies and the practice of the racist and discriminatory policies becomes an issue of a rule of law, excessive racist legal practices, it becomes much harder for me as a human rights activist, as a human rights lawyer, to challenge that. Definitely within the Israeli legal system. For sure, I mean, this is also crossing the border to the West Bank with the validation law and with many other coming. And it becomes harder and harder. And then my last point, it seems that with the political construction of the Israeli political system in the past few years, I mean, all along, but more extremely in the past few years, it seems that the opposition does not really function in Israel. And there are consensus on many issues that we disagree with as Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel and its practices on both sides of the Green Line. And it seems there's nothing internally to deter Israel from this highway, the fastest highway to something really extreme. The US at some point played this role on and off in a very limited way, and this is gone now. And this is why I think it's really crucial at this time that organizations that like UN, maybe other international community to step in to try to create something that deters this deterioration further. I think I will end now and then to the next.
Okay, building on this, I mean, speaking of Israel's policy in Gaza, Israel's deadly response to the protests clearly suggests that Israel is not prepared or ill-equipped to deal with non-violent movement by Palestinians. Now, even before the protests began, Israel deployed its snipers and tanks to the so-called border with Gaza. At a time when Israeli Knesset members went on record assuring Palestinians that, quote, the IDF has enough bullets for everyone. On the same day, I mean, the IDF tweeted that, quote, we knew where every bullet went. And I asked them, does that include the 8-month-old child who died last night? Now, the question remains, what has Israel done to address the grievances that sparked the protests in the first place? Nothing. Instead, the Israeli government issued a statement that the Gaza protests are, quote, a state of war where human rights law does not apply. When it comes to Gaza, it seems Israel does not even offer human rights the complement of hypocrisy. Israel's prime defense minister was catering to this notion when, at the peak of the demonstrations, he went on record and stated, quote, there are no innocents in Gaza. In other words, if you see every person in Gaza as a potential terrorist, then every policy is justified. Another Israeli military leader, Amos Gilad, also said clearly, quote, we do not do Gandhi very well. In other words, to understand what's going on in Gaza, just listen to what they say. All right, I'll give you the floor. Itay. Thank you.
Maybe just briefly address the question in regards to the ICJ advisory opinions. I think what you find in common with both with the 71 Namibia and the 2004 Wall opinion is that they state the condition of international law as it was at the time. They don't innovate, they don't reinvent international law, and perhaps rightly so. But you know who is. As my colleagues have said, it's Israel that seems to reinvent international law, including in the state response to the recent petition on the rules of engagement in Gaza, but in many other instances, trying to create this legal limbo. International humanitarian law does not apply because it's not occupied. It's perhaps disputed territory, and there is this very odd formulation of adhering to the customary and humanitarian articles of the Geneva Convention or the Hague Regulations, if they are, but they are all customary and humanitarian. And then international human rights law doesn't apply because Israel negates, including its numerous submissions to treaty bodies, the extraterritorial applicability. So Palestinians benefit neither from IHL, not from neither or IHRL. So they're supposed to be in this legal limbo. That can't be. And this is what makes the quest towards another ICJ advisory opinion quite complicated, because it's not about restating the law as it is now. It's about trying to see where the law has trying to capture where it has progressed and perhaps where it could possibly grow to afford Palestinian protection. And that would be also my response to Munir. At the core of this is the protection of Palestinian. I think one facet, this has not been the subject of this panel, but I just want to mention this briefly. There needs to be a redoubling of effort to protect Palestinians and to provide relief to Palestinians. This is short of ending occupation, short of liberating Palestine. We need to provide relief to those who are at risk, those who suffer. And some of you may know that 2017 represented a 10-year low in terms of aid to Palestine. And by that, I refer both to direct budget support to the Palestinian Authority or the government of Palestine in terms of developmental and humanitarian finance. I'm not gonna burden you with the numbers. Suffice it to say that between 2014 and 2017, there has been an 18% reduction in aid to Palestine. That is a substantial reduction. I can tell you from looking at partial figures for 2018, we are doing far worse than we did in 2017. And I think we all understand that there are demands in the region and around the world, but Palestinians require assistance, relief, and aid, and state, for one, could recommit and redouble their efforts to provide that much-needed relief to Palestine. And I think we'll come back maybe towards the end of the hour towards other measures at the disposal of states to ensure respect for international law. But I would say in the interim, in the meantime, providing humanitarian assistance is absolutely imperative.
Prior to going into closing remarks, we'll take one more question from the woman here, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for this conversation. I'm happy we've got into the meat of, the colonialism, settler colonialism model versus the occupation and other really important interventions. I was wondering if we could bring it back to Mr. Epstein's intervention during his opening remarks. And I'm glad that you discussed annexation. I find that it's a very tangible and real possibility that often gets ignored in mainstream discourse. I was wondering if you could shed some light on the territorial gerrymandering that takes place, not just in the Jerusalem area, or the Greater Jerusalem area, which I personally think is an invention by the Israeli regime, but also on both sides of the Green Line, how has borders and territories been manipulated for demographic concerns, but also for land theft and other land grabbing opportunities? And my second question is perhaps a bit more esoteric. I'm intrigued particularly by this concept of innocence in Gaza, as was mentioned by Dr. Assi about Avigdor Lieberman's comments. And I heard Suhad speak the other day about the concept of the civilian nature of refugees in Gaza. And I know that particularly, a core tenet of the Israeli propaganda machine is to reduce Palestinian refugees into sort of militarized extremists. But actually, I think perhaps one of the most interesting elements of the occupation, or the most tragic elements of the occupation, is the way that settlers are militarized civilians in the West Bank, and how the way that they operate in the West Bank is as a militarized force that self-organizes and has a very complicated apparatus of militarizing and controlling West Bank terrain. And so with that in mind, how do we make sense of accountability for those settlers in the West Bank when we do have discussions about decolonization and accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And as I turn to the panelists, I might ask you as well to please keep in mind that this is your closing comments, but also specifically to address the question of what do you think are the most astute and productive interventions? As we end this conversation, what are your recommendations, both to nation states, but also to civil society, on how to address the very concerns that have been raised today about the continual and ongoing displacement and the continual Nakba? So we'll start with Itay, please.
Thank you. Let me just briefly address the question on Jerusalem. I think it should not be left unanswered. There is an initiative currently at play to establish the Greater Jerusalem Municipality. To a degree, it almost corresponds to the Corpus Separatum, to what was delineated as the Corpus Separatum. And it will incorporate the settlement block two settlement blocks. The settlements of Givat Ze'ev, Ma'ale Edomim, and Gush Etzion. So both the Bethlehem periphery, the Jerusalem periphery will all be incorporated into one Greater Jerusalem municipality. Estimates that will add roughly 150,000 settlers to Jerusalem. On the other hand, same plan calls for the revocation of residency for anywhere between 400 to 140, I apologize, anywhere between 100 and 140,000 Palestinians who are currently residents of East Jerusalem, by redrawing the municipal boundary. In some places, it will correspond to the separation wall. In others, where there are Palestinian neighborhoods beyond the wall, so to speak, residents of these neighborhoods will be denied their residency. The residency will be revoked. I should say they will remain, they will possibly remain stateless, unless they acquire Palestinian citizenship. Perhaps they will, but from the viewpoint of Israel, they will be rendered stateless, and that will change the demographic balance within Jerusalem. And this is just one other plan within a long-term goal of establishing Jerusalem, redrawing Jerusalem in a way that creates a demographic balance in favor of Jews. These are the terms used by Israeli officials and by the planning documents. And I think, and those will be my closing remarks, I think this is part of an overall negative trajectory. I want to say once more, the obligation is first and foremost on Israel as the occupying power. Israel has an obligation to conduct occupation in line with international law and bring occupation to an end. That is an Israeli obligation. But that does not relieve the rest of us in this room from taking action to ensure respect for international law as an obligation of conduct or means. And let me give a few tangible ideas. One that I've referred to in my previous comment is ensuring support for aid to Palestine. I think that is a testament and a measurement of it goes well beyond solidarity with the Palestinian people. It affords them protection. But member states may and should consider other measures to ensure respect for international law, particularly when there is a deliberate attempt to negate the distinction between what is sovereign Israeli territory and what is occupied Palestinian territory. One way of doing this, and this is in line with Security Council Resolution 2334, its operative paragraph 5 that calls on respecting that principle of distinction, and its operative paragraph 11 that looks or instructs states to look at measures to ensure respect. I think there's interest in not just resorting to these measures, but reporting on these measures and creating in these halls a positive momentum, reversing the tides of this disregard to international law. I think there needs to be a demonstration that international law, previous or past resolutions of the Security Council, of the General Assembly, do matter. And if that fails, if that political dialogue fails, and perhaps it will, there are other measures to consider. Measures of retortion, such as halting of ongoing negotiations or refusing to ratify bilateral agreements with the erring party, with the government of Israel. Non-renewal of trade privileges, reduction, suspension of voluntary public aid. There are lawful countermeasures that states could adopt in the face of persistent violations, and those include trade and financial restriction and reductions, I've said, reduction or suspension of aid and cooperation agreements. But it requires both a bilateral effort, states to critically reflect on their relationship with Israel, and to adopt those proportionate, lawful measures required to bring it into compliance with international law. But it also requires a multilateral effort, and I'm thinking of numerous multilateral bodies, the European Union certainly included. And finally, and with that I'll conclude, something that we've already discussed today, is referring a specific issue under contention, that of the prolongation and the abusive character of occupation, or as it has been referred to by several scholars, occu-annexation, bringing that to the view of the International Court of Justice, and ensuring the outlook of the international community does not favor its continuation. And going back to my initial comments today, there is a real risk, and we all know that there's, and we hear this often, people say, well, Israeli occupation of Palestine, the disenfranchisement of Palestinians, that's not sustainable. I'm not quite sure what more evidence do we need after 51 years that it is sustainable, unless we take action to bring this to an end. So I fear it is sustainable. I think its prolongation is rather possible, and I think we need to take action to make sure that it does not prolong, because that is to the absolute detriment of Palestinians, and if I may, I believe that is to the absolute detriment of Israelis as well. Thank you.
Suhad, please.
Yani Zena, I have to say that the Israeli policymakers has been very creative. And as much as we can laugh on many things and terminologies and creation of the non-creative, it becomes the reality of people at the end. I want to refer to a few pending bills and suggestions regarding the land grab. One, for instance, is redefining the Nakba. The Nakba is the southern district of Israel within the Green Line. In order to extend the authority of some of the Israeli ministries to South Hebron Hills, one of the suggestions is to, okay, we have the Nakba, we know where it starts and where it ends. Let's redefine the Nakba in a way that it excludes the South Hebron Hills. And it becomes a reality. No Green Line, whoever works here works there. Others like planning and building law, which was still one of the major tools to redesign the geographic scene in Israel on the occupied territories, Israeli law in general, as pending bills. And the most recent, a few days ago, a new report issued by the Attorney General office in Israel, trying to so-called resolve the issue of settlements built on Palestinian private land, aside of the validation law that we spoke about. And there they speak of two tools. One, building on a precedent given a few months ago by the Israeli Supreme Court, which says that the settlers are civil society and that the military governor has the authority to confiscate private land for their benefit. This is one tool that they will be using soon in the West Bank. And the second is something called the good faith, meaning, according to the Attorney General, if he the military governor, contracted with a settler on a land that later became to be realized as a private land, the contract is protected. And the Palestinian cannot reclaim her property. In other words, what the Attorney General is saying is that we can commit war crimes and be immune under the good faith clause. That doesn't really exist under IHL, yeah? But this is the manifestation, again, creating something that doesn't really exist, creating something that violates IHL, all legal frameworks that might apply, should apply to the West Bank. But again, I cannot commit a war crime in good faith. It doesn't really exist, yeah? At the end, let's agree, Ambassador, that again, I don't want to put myself in the position of politician, and I'm not, in terms of framing the solution and how it should look like. But I think we can all agree, as Palestinian people, as human rights activists, as those who are concerned about the Palestinian issue, that the grievances can be resolved, should be resolved on the basis of few components. One, in the occupation for sure. Yeah. Second, racist policies towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which draws from the Jewish character of the state of Israel, should end. And the third, the Palestinian refugees should be granted the right of return. Without these three components, I do not think we can get to a just solution for the Palestinian issue. And if we agree on that, then we're on the same page. All, of course, on the basis of the rights approach towards the different parts of the Palestinian people, wherever they live, including, of course, self-determination of the Palestinian people in their homeland. Thank you.
Seraje, please.
Thank you. Looking forward, we need a fresh way of thinking, perhaps some political imagination, a new political narrative that goes beyond the conventional wisdom and platitudes of Oslo, which proved the disaster for Palestinians, a boon for occupation, and a prelude for the isolation of Gaza. In particular, I would like to highlight three guiding principles here. First, reaffirming the refugee question as the basis for any peaceful reconciliation in Palestine, as envisioned and enshrined in Resolution 194. There is a tendency to depict the crisis in Gaza in purely humanitarian terms, and to reduce the debate on it from a just solution to the refugee question to the question of humanitarian aid. Surely the humanitarian crisis is a tragedy that requires an immediate solution. But as the March of Return reminds us, the crisis in Gaza is essentially political, and it requires a political solution, a durable, comprehensive, not unilateral and piecemeal solution. Israel is a party to at least 2 human rights treaties that proclaim the rights of all persons to return to their own country. It is also worth remembering that Israel was accepted as a member of this international body in 1949 on the condition that it would respect the obligations obtained in the UN Charter, including Resolutions 181 and Resolution 194. This never happened. Second, reintegrating Gaza in Palestinian polity and recognizing it as an integral and indispensable a part of Palestine and Palestinian bid for statehood. Gaza has been largely ignored in the US-led peace process, which focuses its energy on the West Bank, mainly to punish Hamas. Also, Israel's long-standing policy has been to separate Gaza from the rest of Palestine, treating it as, quote, a sui generis territory subject to exceptional security measures that go beyond the reach of international law and human rights. It's worth remembering that the Oslo process has collapsed precisely because it failed to secure the unification and territorial unity of Gaza and the West Bank, which resulted in blocking the ultimate creation of a viable Palestinian state. In other words, no lasting or durable end to the conflict and no feasible Palestinian state is imaginable without Gaza, with its 2 million Palestinians, 1.3 million refugees, its proud history, its economic potential, and its vital access to the sea. Remember, Gaza is the only Palestinian city that has direct access to the sea. Third, and this is also important, the scene of Israeli soldiers killing and maiming protesters in Gaza to scare the rest into their prison enclave was a clear indication that Israel continues to treat Palestinians as subhumans. It's also an indication that reflects the depth of tragedy in Gaza. There's one thing that's worse than being a refugee, and that's living under siege and behind fences. People have no reason to march by the thousand into their death unless they have nothing to lose. And I'm afraid the people of Gaza have reached this hopeless point. We need to help them. And we can do that by ending Gaza's culture of dependency created by the international community, development community over the past decades. Today, over 80% of residents in Gaza are dependent on humanitarian assistance. Besides, international community engagement in Gaza, unfortunately, is confined to periodic eruptions of violence, which it manages through its cluster approach and emergency measures, without any sustained involvement. Surely there is an immediate need for joint rebuilding and reconstruction efforts in Gaza, but in the long run, we need to consider new and creative forms of sustainable development there. Long-term investment has become even more pressing in light of UN reports predicting that Gaza's population will more than double in 30 years. Add to this reports that in 2020, Gaza will be unlivable. Well, by my own calculation, this is only 2 years away. Israel's occupation of Gaza has rendered Gaza a captive economy, an economy of survival, or what Sarah Roy calls de-development. As a result, Gaza has been captured in a vicious circle of building and rebuilding, and civilian lives are reduced to a daily struggle for survival. But this cannot continue. It's illegal, immoral, and untenable. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Our speakers today have presented a broad perspective on what it means for the Nakba to be ongoing, whether in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, or within Israel proper. Displacement continues to be a daily reality affecting the lives of millions of Palestinians. It's a reality that transcends the Green Line. In light of the policies pursued by the current administrations in both Israel and in the United States, the prospects of halting the ongoing displacement and reversing the damage done over the last 70 years have never appeared less promising. And yet the situation is more critical than ever. Our speakers today have put forward some suggestions of things that can be done and how we can respond and intervene amid these challenges, that we might have a fresh way of thinking beyond historical constraints through creative thinking, for the international community to be courageous in the application of international law and holding Israel accountable as the occupying power, to raise the question within the General Assembly to the ICJ about the legal ramifications of prolonged occupation, for the world to double efforts in order to protect Palestinians, those who are most at risk, those who are suffering both through humanitarian and developmental interventions, through aid to Palestine, and for those of us in civil society to be more diligent in not only raising awareness, but also moving and mobilizing in advocacy towards more just policies that address the realities of the occupation, limited access to movement, demolitions, and ongoing displacement. Such proposals serve as a reminder that there are always options available to the international community, even in the most unfavorable of political climates. I'd like to express our thanks to the panelists, to all of you, and to our Vice Chairman for our time together today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cannon. On my part, I also wish to thank you and to thank the panelists and, of course, to thank the participants and whoever, those of you who showed up today and showed interest. Indeed, it was an insightful and interactive discussion. It was a fascinating discussion as well, the legal entanglements, although I would have preferred that the subject matter would have been hypothetical rather than real. But we hope for the best. We hope for the future. We hope that the voices of reason and justice on all sides will prevail, and peace and justice would triumph for the people of Palestine. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to a close on this first day, come to a close of these proceedings. I thank you once again for joining us. I remind you that tomorrow we reconvene for the third discussion panel of the forum entitled Refugees and the Resolution of the Question of Palestine, tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the same chamber. I thank you very much once again, and have a good evening, and the meeting is adjourned.